Welcome both to the program. Can I start with you, Archbishop, because you and your fellow faith leaders of all different religions have signed this letter and this urgent call. You know, up until mid-April, apparently only less than 1% of people have been vaccinated in sub-Saharan Africa. Can you tell me from your own eyes the urgency of the need on your continent?
Thank you, Christine, for having us. The urgency is indescribable because if one looks at the COVAX system and its intention, it's supposed to help the global south and the poorest of the poor countries to vaccinate only 3%. It is destined to fail. And in my context, I've seen people die without saying goodbye to their families. And if one looks at the scourge in India in your introduction, one is anxious that should we have that magnitude in the continent will be wiped off the face of this earth, whilst others are hoarding. So this is not a moral issue only, but it is an issue of greed, and it is an issue that the world should really speak up and stand up against such behavior in the face of death, particularly when monopolies are wanting to make capital instead of saving life.
Golly, Archbishop, when you say wiped off the face of this earth, it's a really dramatic picture and it's a dramatic crisis. So let me ask you, Seth Berkley, you know, according to the WHO, I think only 2% of COVID-19 vaccine doses have been administered in Africa. And of course, their population represents 16% of the world. And we've been reporting on this inequity for months now. And as the Archbishop said, rich countries are hoarding. You're concerned with with the poor nations and the poorest people. What can actually be done? Promises are being made from the highest levels of power. We've heard President Biden himself.
So thank you, Christiana, for having us and for taking on this important issue. The numbers are terrible. I mean, high-income countries, about a third of the citizens have gotten one dose. In the lowest-income countries, it's 0.2%. Clearly, that is not equity. Now, why was COVAX set up? It was because, you know, something like this happened in 2009 in the last epidemic, and we wanted to try to do something else. But as the Archbishop has said, what's happened is there have been export bans, there have not been sharing of doses, and this has been a real challenge. So COVAX has been able to procure over 2 billion doses, which will be available by the end of 2021. That should cover 30% of the population, but they're not here today. At the same time, wealthy countries bought more than 1.5 billion doses beyond the amount they need to cover their citizens because they didn't know which vaccines would work. So what we're asking is that right now, at this critical time, they share those doses so that we can make sure that at least the healthcare workers and the highest risk groups get served everywhere in the world, because we're only safe if everybody is safe. And that's the reality of this pandemic and the new variants and the spread that's occurring.
You talk about how healthcare workers, of course, should get vaccinated. I was stunned to hear a WHO official in Africa today say that it's heartbreaking to watch on television or whatever, as she put it, a 19-year-old in a rich global northern country receiving his or her vaccine, where health workers, you know, who are on the front lines of this pandemic in Africa or India or wherever, cannot get even a first dose. So, Archbishop, you, with this letter, are calling, in fact, on the world's most developed leaders, the most powerful G7 leaders who are coming here to Britain, I think it's in June. You're calling on them to make this a priority and to really get every piece of this puzzle towards sending vaccines to where they're most desperately needed right now. Do you think your message is going to get through?
I'm hoping this message and through your programs and many other voices and people of faith and no faith, the G7 will listen because look at it this way. I was working in Lesotho over the weekend and I had my mask and I had to do the testing because I was crossing the border. And lo and behold, at a hotel where I was staying, there were more people with an American accent and an English accent, and they are here. So the pandemic and the coronavirus does not know color. It does not know race. It does not respect the national flags. And I hope that the G7 will realize that we cannot vaccinate in Europe and think that the variant that comes from other places in India and everywhere will not reach their borders. And we are only safe if everyone is safe. And I want to say also, I mean, Canada is one of the G7, and I was paid that Canada also used the COVAX. Yes, of course, they can, but use the COVAX in the first instance to buy so many vaccines. I would have thought Canada will say, let me go and compete with the others, or let me support the global south to really access more vaccine rather than take vaccines. But to those G7 leaders, please examine your conscience. We are safe together. This is not an apartheid issue where you are driven by capital and monopoly who have already made their profits. Think about life rather than profit.
And of course, at the beginning, that was the pledge, wasn't it, Seth Berkley? It was going to be, intellectual property was going to be shared, the patents, it wasn't going to be about a profit-making motive. I'm stunned to hear that Canada would have accessed vaccines via COVAX, which is meant to be, I thought, for the developing world. Seth, how does that happen?
Well, actually, Christiana, the way COVAX was set up was to try to avoid these bilateral deals. And the idea was to have global solidarity and have equitable access. So we invited all countries to join, wealthy countries, upper middle income as well as low income countries. And for low income countries, we were raising finance to make those vaccines available free of charge. The challenge we've had is that because so many doses were locked up at the beginning, we haven't been able to get doses in the first half of the year. We have a large number of doses, as I've mentioned, for the second half of the year, but obviously we have to oblige the people who have put money on the table to buy doses, and we keep our promises and will do that. Of course, we are encouraging countries that have large amounts of doses to make those available, as well as the companies to go ahead and serve the international market at the same time they serve the wealthy markets. That is really the challenge that's in front of us. The last thing I'd say is that we worked hard to get technology transfers, a lot of them to India. So the doses that are being used in India now are being doses that were being made to be used around the world. Of course, we understand the need. And so we're trying to diversify to other manufacturers to make sure that, we have enough producers around the world to make the doses that are necessary.
And Archbishop, obviously, there is this massive, massive crisis in India right now. Their own, Serum Institute has had to stop exporting. They have a shortage of absolutely everything, and it's beginning to spread across their borders. So given that we know how lethal and contagious it can be if not controlled, and if vaccines aren't taken, I wonder what you would say to people on your own continent, Africans, even African leaders, who some of them, for instance, the late president of Tanzania, have played it down. He told people that God would protect them. I know you're a man of God, but it takes more, right? It takes practical social distancing and masks and all the rest of it. And we hear that so much hesitancy is causing even those supplies of vaccines that are on your continent to either expire or have to be thrown away. So there's a whole nother level of crisis to address on your continent.
Christine, perhaps let me predicate that by saying and underscore what you also said in your comment. I think Gavi and the G7 and the others should really also put moral pressure to bear on the World Trade Organization to relax the TRIPS and to really encourage the technology share. How we are playing our part on some of those non-pharmaceutical interventions like social distancing, washing our hands and putting our masks, even in those communities where water and sanitation in the continent is still a big problem. And if you look at those leaders that are saying no to vaccines, that are saying this is an act of God, in the continent, in the main, they are a very small minority. Because in the continent, we know we've been vaccinated for polio, for TB, and we continue to have struggle with malaria, and we've been vaccinated for Ebola. So, vaccine reluctancy will not be that big in the continent. Of course, there will be skeptics there and there. We will say it from the pulpit. We will say it from our shuls. We will say it from the mosques. We will say it from our schools and universities to say, to encourage people to get their jab when it is available. At the moment, indeed, the trickle that has come into the continent is insignificant. We need the know-how. If you look, if I may put another point, if you look at the amount of money, even if it's not for COVID, that the continent spent on exporting drugs, I'm sure if we had the know-how, we could encourage pharmaceutical companies in the continent to produce their own drugs and then to scale up the production, because all these companies cannot manage to scale up.
Okay, so let me just put that last question to you, Seth Berkley. First of all, the hesitancy, how bad is that around the world? But also, we do know that the head of the Africa CDCs has said that they rely on 99% of their vaccines are imported. They only are able to do something like 1%. So no continent can survive in a healthy way if 99% of what they need has to be imported.
Vaccines are very special things. They're biologics, living things, and they're quite complicated to make. And so what it requires is a long-term plan and investment. And Africa should have more facilities. We actually procure yellow fever vaccine from a manufacturer in Senegal. There's manufacturers in South Africa, but certainly more needs to be done. The challenge right now, and the WTO is getting involved, is to make sure there are tech transfers that go on. The challenge here is not intellectual property, it's know-how, and it's making sure that companies work together to quickly scale up manufacturing and make adequate amounts of doses. That's what we've done with the Serum Institute of India and other manufacturers in Korea, other places around the world to get the doses started, and we need to do more of that to get to the tripling of global production of vaccines that we're going to need if we're going to cover everybody.
Well, look, I really appreciate you coming on, Seth Berkley and Archbishop Mahabo, with this urgent call. So thank you both.